In 1993, Liverpool, UK, a 2-year-old James Bulger was abducted, tortured, and killed. His kidnappers were only 10 years old. They took him to a railway line and they started beating him. The boys walked Jamie across Liverpool to a canal, where he was dropped on his head first and suffered his first set of injuries to his face. Bystanders ignored the crying, assuming young Jamie was with his older brothers. Then on the railway line, they threw paint into his eyes, then kicked and stomped on him. They picked up bricks and stones and started pelting his tiny body. After all this torture, they picked up a 10 kg iron bar and dropped it on Jamie's skull, fracturing his skull in 10 places. The pathologist was unable to determine which of the 42 injuries Jamie sustained caused his death. The boys then left the body on the railway line to make this look like an accident. James' body was cut in two by a train. They were sentenced 8 years and were released in 2001, and they were given new identities. In 2010, London, UK, a 15-year-old Kristy Bamu was brutally murdered on the day of Christmas. He was killed because his sister Megalie Bamu and her boyfriend Bekubi were trying to produce exorcism, as they thought that Kristy had used witchcraft. Kristy was struck in the face with a bar and a hammer, knocking out his teeth, causing him severe pain. He used pliers to twist his ears. He smashed tiles and bottles over his head. He then placed Kristy in the bathtub. The torture was so brutal that it lasted for 4 days, and at one point Kristy begged his sister to die. He was exhausted and could no longer hold his head above the water. Kristy drowned later that night before the paramedics got there. In 2012, Bekubi was sentenced 30 years in prison and Megalie Bamu was sentenced 25 years in prison. In 1992, a 12-year-old Shanda Sharer was abducted, tortured, and burned alive. She was kidnapped by 4 teenage girls. Loveless hated Shanda for stealing her girlfriend, and she wanted to teach her a lesson. She made a plan to kidnap Shanda and scare her by holding a knife to her throat. She brought 3 of her other friends who never even had met Shanda before this. They took her into the forest, took her out of the car and made her strip naked, and then started punching, kicking, and kneeing her in the face. Loveless tried to slit her throat, but the knife was too dull. They then took turns and stabbed her in the chest multiple times. They tied her up with a rope and placed her unconscious into the trunk of the car. After several hours of driving, Shanda started screaming in the trunk. They opened the trunk and stabbed her multiple times until she could not speak anymore. After all this torture, more than 6 hours, they were still not finished. They wrapped Shanda in a blanket, took her to a deserted area, poured gasoline over her and set her on fire because they were not convinced that she was dead. She was burned alive. Lawrence was released in 2000 after serving only 9 years because she had not participated as much in the torture and killing, and she was the first one to confess to the police. Rippy was released in 2006 on parole. In 2007, Tennessee, United States, 21-year-old Channon and her 23-year-old boyfriend Chris were carjacked and they were never seen alive by their loved ones again. Chris was repeatedly raped. He was eventually taken to the railroad tracks where he was executed, shot 2 more times and then set on fire. Chris's girlfriend Channon was held for days and also raped. She was also raped with a chair leg. Bleach had been poured down her throat while she was alive. They then wrapped a garbage bag around Shannon's head before stuffing her whole body into several more bags. She was thrown in a trash bin and she slowly suffocated to death. Davidson was sentenced to death, while others were sentenced to life with no chance of parole. In 1989, Tokyo, Japan, a 17-year-old Junko Furata was abducted by a group of young men. She was tortured for 44 days. She was raped over 500 times by at least 100 different men. She was burned with cigarettes, beaten with iron rods, golf clubs, bamboo sticks, and dumbbells. She was force-fed cockroaches, drank urine, and fireworks were set off in her every body opening parts. She was stomped on, crushed, hung up to used as a punching bag. She was also stabbed numerous times and set on fire. They used every method of torture they could think of. The 4 responsible for this are now out of prison. 3 of them only served 8 years in prison for this unforgiving crime.